Hey everyone, I'm DaleStiles, and this is my Week 3 video discussion. This week we're discussing speaking in a professional setting. I've done this on a couple of occasions. As a senior member of the Navy, it was my job to brief the captain on, a one-on-one or in a planning board of fellow chiefs and officers on the status of my electronic systems, the physical and mental health of my crew, as well as upcoming system maintenance requirements and personal training or vacation requirements of the crew. My speech had to be clear and concise, my data current, and presented in a way that answered most questions before they were asked. But, questions were always asked because that's what captains do. I then had to disseminate information from these briefings to my crew and give it to them in a way that they could understand it, give it time to take notes and ask additional questions, because asking questions is what the crew does. So I've got a large variety of leadership books on the bookcases to my left and to my right. But I chose to find an online source that would be easier to share in this forum. All good leadership books and articles discuss communication in one form or another. One of the first things that I'll quote from my article is something that I've heard in a variety of military leadership courses and in dozens of books. They all find a different way of saying it. They all say it differently. But in essence, they all say the same thing when they say something like, communication is the real work of leadership. You simply can't become a great leader until you're a great communicator. And I agree. This quote comes from the article by Travis Badbury in the Forbes article, 8 Secrets of Great Communicators. And I'll leave a link to that in the discussion box. So I'm not going to go through all 8 of these, but I'll give a few highlights. Bradbury recommends speaking to groups as you would speak to an individual. And my great uncle was a pastor for the Church of God, Anderson, Indiana, in Moore, Oklahoma for many years. And this is one of his great lessons as well. When you talk in a way that each person in the room feels like you're talking directly to them, there's a level of intimacy involved that creates interest for the listener, and it feels like the speaker cares about the listener in a very unique, special way. And he gave me a couple of tips that I actually tried in my military career, and they were extremely beneficial. Another tip is to talk so that people will listen. This involves your ability to read your audience, watching their facial expressions, their body language, and if they're making eye contact with you, or if they're, looking at their watch. Of course, that was back in my day. These days, it would be, fiddling with your phone. So I used to teach radar and mainframe computers, and I had a tendency to teach from the middle of the classroom because it caused the students to pay a lot more attention to what I was saying. And then I looked around the room and I picked the one person that had that deer in the headlights look on their face. I'd have them come up, give them a marker, have them stand at the whiteboard, and then draw the path of the electrons. We had tube amplifiers, and there's certain components that accelerate the electrons and then slow them down in a way that they group together, which creates the amplification. This was an important concept, and if you didn't understand how the electrons traveled through the tube, you failed. This was day one concept stuff. This is the first 15, 20 minutes of class. If you didn't get it, you didn't go any further. And so the rest of the class, you're just listening to So I did this because I failed this section as a student for one reason. I knew exactly how the electrons grouped together in the amplifier, but I had no idea what the names of the components were that caused the grouping. And that lack of knowledge led to my failure. So when I was called in for counseling, I'm like, wait a minute, I know how this works, and I got offended and I started arguing, and I argued that I knew how it worked, but I was calling things made up names like, thingamajig and doo-doo-jawopper and doo-doo-doo-doo, and the chief had me explain every single tube that we had, and while I was describing them, he nudged a couple of instructors and said, you boys need to pay attention, because while he can't name a single component, he knows how these tubes function better than any of you. So when I came back as an instructor, I made sure that the students that had this lost facial expression on their face understood not only the concept of how the electrons flowed through the tube, but they could label every single component. Everybody in the room had to fully understand it, be confident. I had to see that light bulb of understanding go off in their head. Do they get that, that aha moment, right? I'm watching. And when I saw the aha, I get it. Yes, I get it. Thumbs up all around, smiling faces, bright, open eyes, and everybody's going, hey, I didn't understand a single thing I read last night, but now I get it. And so that section of class maybe took an hour of teaching time. If I took 4 hours on it, it was worth it, because then I could speed through the rest of the class, because that had to be understood. You don't just read it and regurgitate it on a test. You had to understand it. So I had to get that through there. Once we got past that, the rest of the class was really pretty simple. It was just different tubes. But you had to understand basic tube to get the advanced tubes. So in the same vein, another tip is to listen so that people will talk, right? I can guarantee you that none of those students would have stood at the front of my class teaching me if I had allowed the rest of the class to make fun of them the entire time. They wouldn't have had any trust in me. They had to trust that I was going to save them before they completely made a fool of themselves. And I did. Gave them that, safety net, put them back up there, try again. I had them repeat things over and over and over and over until they got it. And if we don't listen to those that we want to have conversations with, people will just stop talking to us, They'll just be like, I'm not talking to that guy, One of the biggest ones from this article, one of the biggest tips, is one that I feel like I've mastered from time to time, and that is to connect emotionally. One of my collateral duties on the ship was that of the Protestant lay leader and the command religious programs coordinator. I led the Protestant worship services 3 times a week, in addition to my other duties. I wrote 2 sermons for Sunday and created a facilitation for Wednesday evening Bible study. In order to get people to listen, we have to make them feel an emotion. In those sessions, we typically create an emotion of caring. When we're teaching scripture, it's about love and respect. And if you convey that, then they understand the scripture better. This also works in leadership. There have been many times I've had to deliver bad news and had to get my crew to understand that I was in the same boat they were, literally. Anyway. But even though we were in the same disappointing situation, I felt the same way they did. Yet somehow we needed to not only allow ourselves to feel the emotion of disappointment. We're not going home on time. We're not going to Singapore. We have to go rescue this ship out here. And, sorry. But it's just the way things are. So we had to, feel that emotion of disappointment while still finding a way to remain focused on the mission and inspire the emotion of honor, courage, and commitment to see the mission through. So, tying this to our reading, we're given several examples of decision making and problem solving. Among these examples, we find that the way Tom sort of forced his team through the information that he had to deliver without paying a whole lot of attention to what they wanted, His team literally rebelled against him, showing a lot of different emotions. Some felt shorted, some felt ignored, some were angry, and so on. Several people walked out. They literally walked out on him because they didn't feel like he was listening to them. He lost control of the meeting early on, but proceeded anyway, just kind of bulldozing through the whole thing, not knowing how much damage he was causing. He just felt like he had to get through it, As a result, nothing was done. They didn't decide on a mission statement. His entire group was frustrated with him, the process that he was putting them through, and essentially they gave up and lost the mission of coming up with the mission statement because nobody understood what the mission statement meant, and any questions that were asked were mostly ignored. Had I done this as an instructor, I would have never generated the understanding of complex concepts such as the amplification of power in a tube or something as complicated as waveguide propagation. My students wouldn't even have tried. They probably would have walked out. I mean, we're talking military, so probably not, but I bet you on break they would have gone and knocked on the head instructor's door and said, send me out to the fleet undesignated. I don't understand a thing that guy's trying to tell me. And he's not paying any attention to any of my questions. I wouldn't have been an instructor for very long. So because I taught my students in a way that ensured everyone understood the basic concepts before I moved on, my classes generated consistent test scores of over 95% in a course where they typically had a 35% failure rate. I beat the odds with my students because I slowed down, checked for comprehension on day one before moving into the otherwise straightforward information of the different tubes and their components. So, I'll restate a quote from the beginning. Communication is the real work of leadership. You simply can't become a great leader until you're a great communicator. So, on to the questions. My first question this week is, when you're faced with a difficult topic of conversation, what is your recommendation for approaching a friend or a coworker with an opposing opinion? This is probably a framing kind of a question. Second, when you have explained something to the best of your ability and the person you're talking to is still asking what you believe to be elementary questions, what do you do to help them understand what you're trying to tell them? And that's it. All right, thanks for listening to me today. I'll see you in the comments.